particles in the atmosphere, and these serve as nuclei for condensation, or in other words, cloud production. So the more of this kind of radiation that goes through the atmosphere, the cloudier it's likely to be. Clouds are a great reflector of solar heat. And so the more clouds, the more reflectance of the solar energy takes place. Well, there is a satellite that goes around the sun, and it's accumulated now something like 17 years of data, and what they've measured is that the strength of the sun's magnetic field has been decreasing at a rather rapid rate over that 17-year period. And so now there is what's called a solar magnetic index, called an AP index, and it has gone down almost to zero. It goes down to a number of 3, which is compared to what it should be right now, which is about 50. Shows that the sun's magnetic field is very weak. And we know that during times in the past when this has happened, we've had global cooling. So there's every reason to believe that the change in the sun's magnetic field may have a strong effect on global climates. And that trend right now is cooling, not warming. And the last time this happened was 200 years ago, and we had a very strong cool period, 1790 to 1820, where all kinds of historic events were affected by the cooling. And 200 years before that, in the 1600s, there was a significant cooling called the Maunder minimum, which led to widespread reduction in crops in Europe, and a third of the population died from famine and disease. And so the question now is, with respect to the sun, are we heading for a minimum solar output, which is similar to 1800, or maybe even worse, like the one in the 1600s, for the next 30 years, or maybe even 50 years? We won't know until we get there. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Time will tell. And right now, time is telling us that the Earth is no longer warming.
So everybody that has been drawn in to the global warming scare and CO2 and the entire story about that is preparing for something we're not in the midst of. They're preparing to be climate refugees and heating up and the sea level rising. And all that preparation is the wrong preparation because we're in a totally different condition of climate change.
Yes, and the stakes are not insignificant. The stakes are huge because if you consider this, the predictions have been made by the CO2 proponents that we're going to have a 10-degree increase Fahrenheit in temperature by the end of the century, and that will be disastrous. If that were to happen, it would be disastrous. They predicted that we're going to have 1 degree per decade increase in temperature. But we've now had a full decade, we've had at least 12 years, since they made that prediction. So how well does their prediction match with what has actually happened? And the truth is that their computer projections failed miserably, that they were totally wrong. The temperature today is not 1 degree warmer than it was in the year 2000. So their models failed. That's a very important point because all of the hype that you hear about global warming is based on computer models, not on real life data. And if the climate is in fact cooling, as I have projected based on the various kinds of solar and geologic data that is available, if that's happening, you think about the consequences. As the temperature goes down, food production goes down. And that's happening right now. India is very cold this year.
Right.
It was cold last year. So is China. China had record-breaking cold last year. North America was cold. All of the continental areas of the northern hemisphere and probably also the southern hemisphere. But for the northern hemisphere, everything has been cooling, and that has reduced food production just in the last 3 years. Well, think about what happens if it gets worse. We have lower food production. There are millions of people primarily in third world countries that are at the brink of starvation already, especially in Africa, where a small difference in the food availability means a lot of people will starve to death. So if we're entering a period of global cooling and we have decrease in the food production, then a lot of people are going to starve to death. Think about the energy consumption. What happens when the climate gets cooler? The per capita, per person use of energy increases. You use more energy because it's colder. And what that means is that we're going to need more energy if the population were constant forever than we have in the past, just because it's colder. So the energy requirements are going to increase. They're not going to remain constant. And then you throw in the real joker, which is the real problem that we're facing right now, way more important than climate change, and that is population increase. The doubling rate for the world's population is given by various people in about 38 to 40 years. In other words, the population will double every 40 years. So by 2050, the population will be somewhere between about 9 billion and more than that. How much more is speculative. And so how are we going to feed and provide energy for 3 billion additional people over what we have now with decreased food production and no substantial increase in energy production? And it's a real calamity. So if we spend trillions of dollars, which is what it would cost, in a futile chase after CO2 in the mistaken idea that this will somehow affect climate, then we will have spent our money needlessly, and we won't have the resources necessary to cope with the very real problems that we're going to be facing.
Well, maybe that's part of the agenda. Maybe it is part of an agenda. Maybe not an obvious one, maybe not a stated one or a formal one, but maybe it's in there. Remember that a lot of the climate objectives began with the Club of Rome. I mean, you can't deny that. The agenda began in the Club of Rome as an agenda to catalyze and to create an environmental problem that was basically our fault.
Right.
I mean, this is in their written papers. So maybe it is part of the mix, and maybe that's what's going on. I mean, why would anybody create an agenda about climate, turn CO2, which is food for plants, into a boogeyman? Why would you do that? And then create a carbon system that has nothing to do with the cycles of climate? It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, but it makes sense if you look at the climate meeting that took place in Copenhagen last year and the meeting that just took place recently in Cancun, and the proposals that were made for world treaties dealing with global warming, climate change, CO2 production, that sort of thing. And if you read the actual documents, which were intended to be signed as a binding treaty by all nations that were attending that, including the U.S., what you'll see is that they were setting up a world government to be run by a secretariat of the UN, which was not elected, and all countries were to cede sovereignty, national sovereignty, to this UN group, so that we would, in fact, have a global kind of government that superseded all national governments. So if the Secretariat made a decision, it would supersede anything that the U.S. Could do, and these would be binding. And you think, my God, what a powerful kind of agency that would be. And then another part of that Copenhagen Protocol was that the so-called developed nations were to pay what was called a climate debt to the poorer nations in terms of a redistribution of wealth. The wealthy nations would have to lower their standard of living, and the present administration pledged $200 billion a year to go into this so-called climate fund, which is to be distributed to third world countries to try to increase their economic situation, which is a noble effort to be sure. But the whole idea was to redistribute the wealth of the world and to diminish the living standards of those developed nations and increase those of underdeveloped countries. So there's a very strong political bias background to the whole climate scare. And the basis for all this was that, well, if we don't do that, CO2 is going to cause the world to have a global catastrophe. Fear is a big driver in all this.
What's the relationship that CO2 has on the geologic conditions around the world?
Okay, some things that need to be upfront are factual and which are not disputed by any competent scientists, and that is that there is very little CO2 in the atmosphere.